If you've seen this before, allow the others to absorb it on their own and get the message from it. We start with the assumption that A equals B. Okay, now we multiply both sides by A. So you get A squared equals AB. Then you subtract B squared from both sides. So you get A squared minus B squared equals AB minus B squared. Now, as a matter of fact, A squared minus B squared equals A plus B times A minus B. Is that known and obvious to everybody? Or is that problematic? That A plus B times A minus B is the same as A squared minus B squared? Yeah? Some people doubtful? I'll show you it if you need to be shown. Yeah, a couple of people seem to be doubtful. Let's try it over here. There's A plus B and A minus B. Now let's multiply, okay? So now, I'll multiply A times A is A squared. A times B is AB. Now I got minus B times A, so that's minus AB. Minus B times B is minus B squared. That's what it says when you multiply it out fully, but this is AB minus AB, so this cancels. So you end up with A squared minus B squared. That's the left side. On the right-hand side, you extract the B, and you get B times A minus B. Well, you have A minus B on both sides, so you divide through by A minus B, and you get A plus B equals B. Well, but now A equals B, so you can substitute one for the other, so you get B plus B equals B. In other words, 2B equals B. Now you divide both sides by B, and you get 2 equals 1. What do you do now? You say, oh, look at that. Ain't math grand? We learned something new. That 2 equals 1. Does that sound like the right resolution to the situation? We now have learned that 2 equals 1. I hope you're reluctant. I hope this strikes you as perhaps a bit extravagant. Yeah, I know you did math. And I know it looks like it's doing the same thing to two sides of an equation, so it'll be okay. But this is wrong. Capital W. It's definitely wrong. So something's got to be wrong here. It has to be wrong here. It can't be correct. I say, well, where's the mistake? Multiply, subtract, divide, abstract. So A plus B equals B, right? Everything we did is kosher. Yeah. But it's got to be wrong because 2 isn't equal to 1. It just isn't. And if you have no resolution of it, what you say is 2 isn't equal to 1, and there's something wrong here. Even if I can't find it, I'm positive there's something wrong here because you can't get to 2 equals 1. Just can't be done. This is what I call keeping your philosophical balance. You have a reason on one side, you have a reason on the other side, and you weigh them up. And even if you can't explain what's wrong with one side, you pledge allegiance to the other side on the grounds that the other side is much more certain, much firmer in your mind than the challenging side. There may be exceptions to this, but this is the general starting point when you're dealing with situations like this. Now, the truth is, does anybody know where the mistake is here?
I don't know where. I think there was a divide by 0.
What is A minus B? If A equals B, what is A minus B?
0.
0. Oh, that's a no-no. You don't divide by 0. You can't divide by 0. You can't go on with the proof. Why can't you divide by 0? Why not? Says so in the book. No question about it. Yeah, but let me show you what's wrong with dividing by 0. Right? Isn't 2 times 0 equal to 3 times 0? Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Because they're both 0, right? Now, divide through by 0 and you get 2 equals 3. And that's not correct. See, 0 is the great leveler. It changes everything into itself by multiplication. And therefore, it doesn't do the same thing to two sides of an equation. That's being able to divide by 0. So now, the next time somebody presents to you an argument, and usually these arguments are designed to prove very surprising conclusions. There is no such thing as morality, or maybe the past doesn't exist, or maybe you don't exist, or who knows what, something very surprising. And you listen to him, and he gives you a story, and you think, well, yeah, I guess so, maybe. And he says, so? You have to accept my conclusion. No, I don't. No, I don't, because I can say, well, you're telling me a story. That's right, you are telling me a story. And I haven't got a way to criticize the story, but the conclusion that you are offering is so outlandish, so outrageous, your story isn't strong enough to support it. G.E. Moore was one of the great professors of philosophy in the beginning of the 20th century at Cambridge University. He used to argue with people who are idealists. Idealism, this is of course a parody, but the general idea is all that exists is things that you experience. There are only your experiences, nothing else. Does that sound crazy? Yeah, it sounds crazy. And in the 50s and 60s, they gave it up for no good reason. But at any rate, that's another story. At any rate, that's what they thought. So G. Moore would say, here's how I deal with an idealist. I say, this is my right hand. This is my left hand. Hands are physical objects. Therefore, there are physical objects, and therefore, your idea that everything that exists is only my inner experience is wrong. So the students would say, but Professor Moore, they won't agree that these are hands. I said, I know they won't agree, but ask yourself, what do you know better? That you have hands or their philosophical story? Which is more convincing? Which is more positive? Their story about what you can know, what you can't know, and if you're not paying attention, if you're dreaming, and so forth and so on, whole long story, or that you have hands. I suggest to you, you know much better that you have hands than you can verify that their story is correct. So if it's a contest between your knowing you have hands and they're telling you a story, you should say, it's a nice story, and you know, maybe I'm not smart enough to figure out what's wrong with it, but I have hands, thank you very much. It's not good enough to do the job. Can you ever do the job? Yes, you can. There are ways, but this sort of way isn't good. And I'll give you one final example. I don't know if anybody here has heard of Zeno. Zeno was a pre-Socratic philosopher. We only have what others report of his writings. And he had 3 simple mathematical arguments. You ready for this? Arguments that nothing moves. Nothing moves. There's no motion. Motion is impossible. It took 2,300 years for people to think up how to answer his arguments. In the intervening 2,300 years, I don't think there's any human being who ever thought, golly, maybe Zeno's right. Maybe he's right. Maybe nothing moves. I mean, he has these arguments, you see. And they're very strong arguments. We don't know how to answer them. So maybe not. No, nobody. Everybody was convinced there's got to be something wrong because obviously things move. It's like you can't. An abstract argument isn't strong enough to overcome something like things move. Now you ask me, what are the rules of what's stronger than what? Very difficult. I can't tell you in general, I can't define it, but there are clear cases. The cases that I'm giving you are clear cases. So when somebody presents you an argument to what seems to be an outrageous conclusion, check your options. There may be an option to say, I hear what you say, I hear your argument, I don't see the flaw in it, but it's not strong enough to give up this understanding because it's much stronger. It's always an option. It's not irrational, it's not dogmatic to do that. We all do that. There's more to say, but at least that's what I wanted to set down as a beginning. So now I want to start with a proposed argument that the very concept of God is self-contradictory. The very concept of God is self-contradictory. And therefore, there can't be any God. Because the very thing you're talking about can't exist because it's self-contradictory. So, okay, I hear you. That's your project. Let's hear how you go about it. Well, the critic says, answer me this question. Can God create a stone so heavy that he can't lift it? Yes or no? Well, let's see now. What are my options?
Yes, he can create a stone so heavy that he can't lift it, then I guess he can't lift it. Then it's something he can't do. Then he can't be all powerful. No, he can't create a stone too heavy for him to lift. Well, then there's something he can't do. He can't create that stone. Either way, there's something he can't do. And that means that he's not all powerful. If your idea of God is that he's all powerful, then it leads to a contradiction. And if it leads to a contradiction, it's time to order the cheeseburgers. Because clearly, there is no such God. Now, before we take the argument apart, I hope you're thinking, who cares about stones? Is that serious? Why should I be worried about that? Okay, suppose I didn't have any answer to that question. Would that mean there's no creator of the universe, there's no individual providence, there's no good and evil? Why would you draw a conclusion about all of that from this little puzzle about a stone? There are puzzles, okay? So there are puzzles. Surely what I ought to do is say, I don't have an answer to the puzzle, but that doesn't justify giving up my whole worldview, my whole belief system. And if that sounds a little bit dogmatic, let me quote to you a remark that was made by a professor, a philosopher who has a great reputation in some quarters. I don't share it, but his name is Richard Rorty. I heard him at a national convention say the following: every scientific theory that has ever been accepted was accepted with known counterexamples. And when you go from theory to theory, you're trading this theory with its failures for this theory with its failures. Every theory has always had failures, including the present ones, which have failures. And how we do that, no one has a good account. How do you make the overall judgment that this theory with its failures is inferior to this theory with its failures, and therefore we should move from one to the other? It's a very, very difficult, unsolved philosophical problem. So everybody is looking at his system and looking at where it doesn't work and measuring to see, well, if it doesn't work over there, should I give it up? Shouldn't I give it up? And it's a tricky judgment, and it can be made wrongly, and you have to change your mind afterwards. But it certainly isn't the case that if there's a problem, give it up and junk it, and then we'll go look for something else. That's just not correct. Let me give you a real case history before I go back to stone too heavy to lift. Real case history from the history of astronomy. Newton promulgated his laws, and with it you could describe the courses of the planets vis-a-vis the sun, planets vis-a-vis one another, and gave a very good description. Except for two cases. One case was Neptune. Neptune didn't move right. Just didn't follow the laws that Newton laid down for it. So there were two schools of thought. Maybe Newton's wrong. Maybe. It works where it works, but sometimes it doesn't work. Is that universal? That was one school of thought. The other school of thought was no, there's another planet that we haven't discovered, and its presence, its gravity is distorting what Neptune does, and that's why it's not moving correctly. So there were two schools of thought. That's very objective. They took both possibilities into account. The second school of thought that there's a planet did a calculation and said, we say there is a planet you haven't discovered, and if you point your telescopes in that direction at that time, you'll find a new planet. Now, that's a very, very daring prediction. You go out as far as where Uranus was discovered, there are billions and billions of miles of space. You're going to point it in one direction and find it. And they found it. It was an astonishing triumph for Newton's theory and for the calculation to tell them, look there and you'll find a planet. So there, Newton's theory was supported. The other one was Mercury. Mercury doesn't move right. Planets move on ellipses. This is exaggerated, but it looks something like this. And the whole ellipse rotates. It's called the perihelion. So it goes like this. And then it's going like this, and so forth and so on. According to Newton, you calculate how fast should the ellipse rotate, it should go at a certain speed, and it wasn't going at that speed. It was wrong. So the first thing they thought was, just like we solved it for Neptune by finding an extra planet we didn't see before, let's hunt for a planet in the vicinity of Mercury that's distorting its motion also. And they did. They hunted and hunted. They didn't find one, but of course, even there, the space is big enough to miss it if it's there. But they were hunting. Along came Einstein. Einstein's laws are different from Newton's laws, make different predictions, and he calculated that Mercury should move exactly the way it moves. Can you imagine the excitement of getting something right that Sir Isaac Newton got wrong? I can't imagine excitement like that. Right? He calculated it, turned out to be right. There he had to change the whole theory. To get this right, he had to change the whole theory. So sometimes there's a way to save the theory because there's some disturbing element which you can take into account. Sometimes you have to change the whole theory, and it's not obvious what you should do. So when someone has a problem, you don't roll over and play dead. You say, everybody lives with problems. Sometimes they will undo the system, sometimes they won't undo the system. And you measure in the meantime how central the problem is to the main points of the system, or how far it is out on the periphery. If I don't solve it, what would happen? And that's certainly the way one would start with respect to the idea of a stone so heavy that God can't lift it. Okay, that implies there's something he can't do. No. If he can bring the rain and give success in war and give you long health and everything, I'll leave the stones for another day. Yeah.
I heard that the Rambam has a point on this that says like humans are bound by physical impossibilities. Like you can't lift 2,000 pounds or 10,000 pounds, but God is the way we know God is to be like locked by logical impossibilities. You can't make a four-sided triangle and stuff like that. How do the rabbis like feel about that? I know there's like controversy on some of the
Okay, I was going to bring that in a minute, but since you bring it up, it's a very interesting point. He says exactly that, what you're saying. If I'm not mistaken, it's in part 2, chapter 17 of the guide. That, of course, what we call physical law or we call physical impossibilities are nothing to God. He creates the physical world. But, now, you have to be very careful. There are some things which we do not say he can do. That doesn't imply we say he can't do it. Those are two different things. The knot is in two different places. We don't say he can do them because they are impossible, says the Rambam, and the impossible has a fixed nature, and we do not worry that we are implying weakness to God when we deny that he can do these things because the impossible has a fixed nature. His example is that the diagonal of a square can't be equal in size to the side of the square. Just can't. Now, I've thought about this for a long time, and I've tried to look it up. I have no clue what he means when he says that it has a fixed nature, and that God can't do it, therefore. The natural response of the critic would be to say, it has a nature, hey, well, how did it get the nature? Didn't he create that nature? And if he created it, why is he bound by it? And I think, given the Rambam's words, that's definitely a reasonable question to ask. I'm going to use this idea, but I'm going to give a modern explanation for it. And I can't explain what the Rambam is saying. I'm going to use it in a moment. Okay, so but you're definitely on the right track. Well, let's see. We started off by saying God is all powerful. And then I slipped over to saying, well, then he could do anything. Are those exactly the same? All powerful versus he can do anything? Maybe not. All powerful would mean if there's something to be done and it requires power, he always has enough power to do it. You're sitting with a task to be accomplished, and the question is, has he got enough power? Has he got enough strength to do it? He always has enough strength. If the question is how much strength, he has unlimited strength. But maybe there are cases where the problem with doing it isn't a matter of strength. maybe there are other problems with doing things than a matter of strength. The word all-powerful might not apply to that. And there are two kinds of examples where I think we should be reluctant to insist that God can do. My first example is due to a philosopher named Yehuda Gelman. Do we want to say that God can learn something new? Learn something new. That's a genuine ability. Everyone in this room has it. Does God have that ability? Doesn't it sound a little funny to say that God can learn something new? When I say that I learned something new, am I contradicted by that verse? No, it's new to me. It's not new, but it's new to me. I learned it because I didn't know it before. I'm not saying it's new. I'm saying it's a new addition to my knowledge. We don't want to say that about God, do we? Because God knows everything already, right? He's omniscient. So that sounds funny. How about God can improve? We can improve. Improving is a general ability. Why wouldn't you want to say that God can improve? Because God's supposed to be perfect. And the perfect is that than which there is no better. So of course he can't improve. So first of all, going from all-powerful to doing everything is a mistake because there are some things which we really want to deny that he can do because certain abilities are had only by imperfect beings. To have that ability means you're imperfect. I don't want to say that about God. That would contradict his perfection. I'm certainly not committed to that. So that's one kind of thing where I don't want to say God can do, and here I want to say that he can't do. That's a second category, which the Rambam was talking about. Can God make a square whose diagonal is equal in length to its side? Or can God win a game of chess by checkmating his opponent if he has only his king? Okay, it's hard for you and me, but we're talking about God. Could God do that? Or could God correctly spell the word table with exactly 4 letters? Well, it seems like we're reluctant to say that God can do things like that. Now the question is, why would we be reluctant? So again, the Rambam says because it has a fixed nature and we don't attribute to God any weakness, we don't say that he can do those things. I don't understand the Rambam. But here's a modern thought. Again, not everyone will agree with it, but then in philosophy, there's nothing that everyone will agree with. Here's a modern thought. Maybe checkmate with just your king, or diagonal of the square equal to the side, maybe those descriptions aren't meaningful. Maybe they aren't meaningful. It would be like someone saying, you think God can do everything, right? I'm very frum. Yes, I can. Yes, I do. So, well, okay, tell me, can God blah? You have to say yes, because you're frum. And you believe God can do everything, so he's got to be able to blah. Yeah, but what's blah? I mean, that's just a noise. God can blah isn't the sentence, because part of it isn't words. So, I have to admit, I have to agree to something which isn't a sentence, which doesn't say anything. No question I'm agreeing to that. Just tell the person, have a nice tea and leave me alone. Now, what about square whose diagonal is equal to the side? Is that a meaningful description? Or the simpler one, the one that people use, is square circle. Can God make a square circle? I think the appropriate response to that is not yes or no. That's why I started off by saying you got to say yes or no. No, I don't. What I can say is you haven't succeeded in asking a question because you're using words that don't make a meaningful thought. Let me illustrate this to you. You're on your way to the mall, and your friend calls you, going to the mall. Yes. Could you do me a favor? You got a spare $20? Yes. Please pick up for me a square circle. What would you do? Where would you go look? In the hobby store? In the supermarket? In the painting store? for a square circle. I think what you would say is, I'm sorry, I don't understand. You want a square circle? I don't know what to do. I don't understand what you mean. I can't, it doesn't give me any ideas, Nothing lights up in here when you say square circle. Maybe you could describe it in other terms. I'll be happy to help you, but square circle? It doesn't communicate anything. In the same way that someone asks, can God make a square circle? He hasn't asked a question. He hasn't succeeded in expressing an idea because he's using a pair of words which, when used together, don't communicate a meaning. So, now I'll pick up something that I said 3 minutes ago. That's why I won't say God can make a square circle, and I won't say he can't make a square circle, because it's inappropriate to take a position either way, to say either thing. Let's go back to blah. It's certainly wrong to say that God can blah. Is it correct to say God can't blah? No, neither of that makes any sense, because blah doesn't make any sense. Here you have to do something very un-Jewish. You just have to keep quiet. Don't say anything. Don't say yes, don't say no, just pass it over. Are we together so far? Now, let's look at the stone too heavy for God to lift. So here's the critic. Answer me, Rabbi. I assume you're a rabbi. Look at your hat. You must be a rabbi. No one would wear a hat like that otherwise. Answer me. Can God make create a stone too heavy for him to lift? If he can, he can't lift it. If he can't, then the thing he can't do is make the stone. I say to him, you want a yes or no answer to the question, can God make a stone too heavy for him to lift? I refuse to give you either a yes or no answer, because the words you are using are just as bad as square circle. Stone too heavy for God to lift is just as bad as square circle. I'll show you. Stone too heavy for God to lift means stone too heavy for God, who's all-powerful, to lift. Which means stone too heavy for God, who can lift anything, to lift. Which means stone that God can lift and can't lift. And that's a contradiction. So, when you ask about God's abilities and you put in your description a contradiction, my response is to refuse to answer yes or no, but to point out to you that you haven't succeeded in describing something. You haven't succeeded in giving a meaning to your question. Okay, I hope you're going to ask the obvious question, yeah?
How do we interpret when Moshe is in Mount Sinai and Hashem speaks to him and says, I would come in front of you, but I can't, or you wouldn't be able to handle my light, so you'll see my back, or something like that?
Oh, okay. I'll answer because you asked it. He doesn't say you can't. He said you'll die. You can't, and I don't want you to die.
So he has a face.
Oh, you mean say why? Okay. Every time it says that God did something because he couldn't do the other, it means he has a higher priority that he has decided upon that he wants to preserve. So, for example, he takes away Pharaoh's free will, so he won't do tshuva, because if he does tshuva, then he can't punish him. You say, what do you mean? Let him do tshuva and punish him anyhow. No, but God has decided that tshuva should be all-powerful. That follows from his decision to make it that way. And here, he created the human being in such a way that he wants him to live according to certain natural laws, and according to those natural laws, this knowledge is not accessible to him. And his commitment to the natural laws is more important than his commitment to revealing it to him while he's alive. He is going to get it after death. The Rambam is quite explicit that this knowledge of God is available after death. It's in the 8th chapter of the Laws of Repentance, where he says, Neheni miziv hashchina, enjoying the shine of God's presence, means enjoying the fact that he now finally understands what God is. That's a separate issue, and some people are misled about that and think it's impossible in principle, and so forth and so on. So I'm just mentioning that. Okay, so let's come back here. So now, I show the critic that the stone too heavy for God to lift is a contradiction, and therefore he hasn't asked the question. Now the clever critic will say, Rabbi, you're begging the question. You have a degree in logic? You're not allowed to do that. Really, I am? Why am I begging the question? Well, We are discussing God's power. We're discussing God's perfection. We're discussing the question of whether God can do everything or can't do everything. When you tried to show me that my description is self-contradictory, you snuck in God's being all-powerful into your analysis of what I said. You can't do that. You're just assuming you're right without any argument. Let's go back through it. This is what you said, Rabbi. You said, stone too heavy for God to lift means stone so heavy that God, who is all-powerful, to lift. That's what you said in the second step. And then you went on from there. You have no right to sneak in that he's all-powerful at the beginning. That's what we're discussing. That's what we have to establish. That's called begging the question. So for a first sophomore student of philosophy, it's a nice remark. But it's wrong, and I'll explain to you why it's wrong. If I got that wrong, I'd be in serious trouble, because I taught logic. What's wrong is this. The position of the critic is to show that my ideas are self-contradictory. That means to say, he says, you tell me your ideas, and I'll show you that you can't avoid a contradiction with your ideas. We're not talking now about the subject abstractly. Is it true? Isn't it true? What proofs do you have? What proofs do you have? No. He's saying that my position contradicts itself. Well, since he's attacking my position, I can use my position to defend myself. I can show him that my position is not self-contradictory. His argument against me is a mistake. And that's exactly what I'm doing. I say God is all-powerful, in my sense of all-powerful. And he says, watch me trap you, Rabbi. Watch me trap you. What about that rock? So I say, watch me maintain my position without the rock hurting me. I say God is all-powerful. Because I say God is all-powerful, your description of the rock is self-contradictory. Since it's self-contradictory, it doesn't communicate a meaning or an idea, and therefore your question is illegitimate. I have now defended my position. My position isn't hurt by your argument. So I'm not begging the question. And by the way, all of this is written up. This is on my website called Omnipotence and Evil Part 1. This is all written up there. Are we together so far? Yeah.
You said about God being unable to improve or know a new thing. So how do you reason when the Tanya says that God doesn't seem to when he contracts himself? Doesn't that sound a bit
the symptom isn't a symptom on God, it's a symptom on his light.
God himself doesn't contract himself.
That's right. He doesn't contract himself. There's no such thing. In fact, the Ramchal, who goes through this in great detail, points out that Tzimtzum is another positive creation. So, for example, let's say you have a source of light, which is very strong, and if you shine it on something, it'll burn it up. So you want to prevent it from damaging things. There are at least two solutions. One is reduce the power of the light, and then it won't have that effect. The other is keep the light full power and put up a filter, which blocks part of the light. Tzimtzum is like a filter. It's not like reducing the light. The light is always the same. Ani Hashem, lo shinisi, I don't change. But what you get changes. Yeah, you're very welcome. Okay, so now there is one final objection to this, which I think is a good objection, and it's also written up in this article that I wrote. What about statements in the tradition which are designed to describe a reality but are self-contradictory? What do we do with those? For example, there's a statement that, based on verses, that the Holy of Holies is 20 by 20 amos, and the ark, 20 by 20 tvachim, and the ark is 10 tvachim, so the ark is standing in this space, and then from one side of the ark to the wall is 10, and from one side, the other side of the ark to the wall is 10. You say, now wait a second, hold on. If from this side of the ark is 10, and this side of the ark to the wall is 10, and the ark is 10, that's 30 not 20. Yeah, and so the conclusion that's stated there, the ark didn't take up any space. But of course, the ark did take up space. So, what does it mean? So we want to use relativity, you know, when you measure it with your ruler, the ruler shrinks and so forth and so on. Who knows? That's one case. Another case is where at Sinai it says they saw the voices. Okay, Maimonides says the word saw there means perceive, and you can perceive with your ears, but others don't take it that way. In particular, the rabbinic tradition says something that's absolutely unique, that they saw voices. And by the way, for those who know, this is not synesthesia. In synesthesia, let's say you hear a trumpet and you see red. So there's an interaction between the audio system and the visual system, and we know there are neighbors in the brain. So there's a guy in California who worked out the physiology of this. So it can leak over. But you're hearing the trumpet and seeing red. You're not seeing the trumpet sound. The verse in the Torah is, V'chol ha'am ro'im es hakolos. They saw the sounds. What do we do when we have in the tradition statements which to us are self-contradictory? So I'm telling you that they have no meaning. And they are presented as factual descriptions. So let me give you an extreme parallel. And then I'll maybe obvious how it works here, but I want the extreme parallel, I think, presents it in a way that's easy to relate to. Einstein is going on a world tour, and he has an assistant, a physicist that he works with, to accompany him on the tour. And sometimes when people have questions, they ask this fellow because Einstein doesn't have time for all the questions and so forth and so on. He's good. He's an expert. But he's just not Einstein. They get to China, and the lecture's set up. And then Einstein started to speak in Chinese. Wow, the assistant had no clue that Einstein spoke Chinese. And in particular, the assistant doesn't speak Chinese either. Halfway through the lecture, someone in the audience tugs on the sleeve of the assistant and says, wow, is what Einstein just said true? What should the assistant say? He doesn't speak Chinese. He doesn't know what he said. But he thinks, yeah, but it's Einstein. And I know the lecture, and whatever it was that he said, even if he said something extemporaneously, whatever he said, it's got to be true, even though I don't know what he said. And that's reasonable. That's not a fallacy of any kind. Knowing who Einstein is, though I don't know what he meant, I don't know what the content of his words meant, I can testify that it's true. Here the tradition is telling us there are things that you're unaware of, there are things that you don't understand, things that you don't know. And these words have a way of describing them. You, with your normal understanding of the meaning of the words and the way the words work, can't see that. You can't see it. Okay, we discover things about words like we discover things about other things in life also. The fact that's important for communication is when I read this in the tradition, it doesn't communicate anything to me. It doesn't give me any meaning. And either there's some nuance that I'm not catching in the language, which could be, or the same words could be used to describe something else. And in that case, there's a reality, and the words are related to the reality, but I can't get it. So the honest thing to say is, I don't understand it. That doesn't mean it isn't related to a reality. It's just that I don't see how you get from these words to a reality. So to me, it doesn't communicate anything. And I think that I'm preserving everything that I said before. When the guy says, what about the stone he can't lift, Rabbi? I have every right to say, you haven't communicated anything to me. You yourself don't have any understanding of it because it's self-contradictory. And that being the case, you haven't succeeded in asking a question. And if there's another interpretation that neither of us has thought of that could be given to the words, you don't have it, and you didn't mean it, and you're not asking it. So your critique is an incompetent critique. Okay? Now, this illustrates both things that I wanted to start with. That on the one hand, if you have a problem, you don't roll over and play dead because you have a problem. You have to assess how serious the problem is versus the rest of what you believe in, how strong it is. And I'm also illustrating that the tradition relies on our logic. The tradition will tell us things which, in order to figure them out, we have to think them through. We have to analyze them. Sometimes the tradition takes it for granted that we're going to think carefully about things. We're not just going to throw up our hands and resolve to follow the rules. Because Baruch Hu communicated to us because he wants us to understand. He wrote us a book. He didn't write the book to tell us afterwards, but you can't imagine what it means. So, forget it. Just, mouth the syllables. In particular, he gave us instructions what to do. So surely we're supposed to be able to understand it. And the understanding might require some thought. Sometimes you hear that there's a verse, King David, King Tamu Uruki Tov Hashem. Taste and see that the Kodesh Baruch Hu is good. Meaning, you can assess through your own experience with thinking it through and analyzing it that Hashem is good. And sometimes I hear, who knows what good means to God? I mean, who knows if we have any, why should we think of any clue of what Tov means in God's vocabulary, so to speak, or in God's mind? So, how do you get off the ground in the project? And the answer is that God wrote the book for us. It isn't as if we snuck into his library and found his private diary and saw his own private notes. We're trying to figure out what was he writing to himself. He wrote this book to us so that we should study it, learn it, analyze it, understand it, and apply it. So he's got to be using a vocabulary that we're supposed to understand. Furthermore, we don't expect him to be just lying to us. Listen, Tov means marshmallows, but I'm not going to tell you that because that's too hard for you to understand. You think Tov is giving charity. You think Tov is being courageous. You think that, you play with that, you live your lives that way, but really Tov is marshmallows and, you're just doing something that's irrelevant. God didn't create the world for frivolous purposes. He wants us to understand this because it's true. Are there different levels of understanding? Yes. Could we have false impressions for what we understand? Yes. But is it totally mistaken? Totally off base? No, surely not. Surely not. So this is to understand how he describes himself. And certainly this is to understand the rest of the tradition, which is vastly invested with reliance on human logic. We have a legal tradition. You've been studying it. The legal tradition is vast. It has an enormous amount of information, and it has general rules and particular applications, and there are contradictions and resolutions. There are arguments that derive conclusions. A tradition like that is supposed to be understood. If we couldn't trust our logic, generally, then we would have no access to such a tradition. Are there mistakes? Sure, there are mistakes. But we have to be able to trust it accurately and generally, otherwise we wouldn't be able to deal with the tradition at all. So to speak, God would be creating a project that has no logical conclusion. And that, again, we don't credit God with that kind of mistake. Same thing's true when you come to analyzing the world. There are a lot of laws of the Torah that you can only apply if you understand the world. Yom Kippur's coming. I'm a type 1 diabetic. Do I fast or don't I fast? How will this be done? Well, first of all, I go to the doctor and I say, listen, you know my medical record. If I fast 25 hours with no intake whatsoever, what are the likely consequences? Or what are the possible consequences? So the doctor gives me a medical opinion. Then I go to the rabbi and I say, here's what the doctor says are likely and possible consequences of fasting. And he then makes the legal decision, someone with those possible liabilities should or should not fast. But he's making the decision on the basis of what the doctor says. If we had no reliable information about the world, you couldn't formulate a law that way. The law wouldn't be applying to any reality. So obviously, if the law does apply that way, that means that we are trusting our knowledge of the world generally. Generally. Nothing's infallible, but generally. What happens? Let me ask you this. I came across this now. What would happen if somebody said to you, I never changed my mind? You know why? Because a person who changes his mind is unreliable. Because what he says today, he might not say tomorrow. So therefore, I never changed my mind. There was a British economist named Keynes, and he had a position, and then he changed his position, and a reporter said to him, Professor Keynes, 15 years ago you said this, and now you're saying this. He said, yes, when I come across new information and new calculations, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? When you come across new information, new calculations, you don't change your mind? Are you supporting that? I think we would all agree that if you knew that a person had a principle never to change his mind, that would make you not trust him. I change my mind several times every day because I have very smart chavrusos. Very smart chavrusos. And they catch me in this mistake or that nuance or whatever it is, I change my mind several times a day. So that's where your logic becomes self-reflective. You use your logic to criticize your own logic. And that's crucial. That's absolutely crucial. I meet people who call themselves skeptics. You got to prove it to me. I don't take anything for granted. I'm a skeptic. And I ask them, really, are you skeptical of your own skepticism? Have you ever asked yourself whether your standards are right? Whether the criteria you have are right? You say he didn't prove it. Why? Because he didn't meet my standards of proof. Who says your standards of proof are correct? What about self-skepticism? That's what the chavrusa method is supposed to induce. You know very well that when you read and you explain, your chavrusa is sitting there waiting. When am I going to catch him? I'll catch him. He said that. Down! So you think you're self-critical. I don't want to be caught out. So I think, how could I be caught out? Maybe this is a mistake. Maybe I should check that. Maybe I shouldn't say it that way. That's great. That's great. You're changing your mind all the time. That means your final result has run the gauntlet of a tremendous amount of criticism. It's much, much more likely to be correct if that's the case. So the idea of relying on logic is something which definitely is a general principle of the Jewish tradition, together with the idea that like everything human, it could be mistaken. Questions up to here? Okay, then I'll make one more remark. You know we had a Sanhedrin, and one of the functions of the Sanhedrin was to give decisions about legal questions, especially ones which local courts had trouble in deciding. So it would come to the Sanhedrin, they would give a decision. Now, what happens, let's say the question's about Shabbos. Is it permissible to do something on Shabbos or not? And they gave the decision, it is permissible. Okay, so Sanhedrin said you can do it, so I do it. 10 years later, by the way, 10 years later, it's not the same Sanhedrin. People die, people retire, new people replace them. Question comes up again, and now they say, no, it's not permissible. Do I have to take responsibility for failure in the intervening 10 years? Now, in American legal system, I suppose this is true in other legal systems, there's a rule of no ex post facto laws. You make a law, the law only applies from then on. Doesn't apply to the past. The practical reason for that is, if tomorrow they could make a law which would say that what I did today is illegal, I would never be sure of what I do. It could always turn out to be wrong. That's why the general rule is when you make a new law, it only applies forward. In our case, the law is ex post facto. And that's because the Sanhedrin is not making the law. It's deciding what the law says. The old law. It could make laws, but I'm talking now where it's interpreting the old law. So if the Sanhedrin changes its mind, it says the interpretation they gave 10 years ago was wrong. This interpretation is correct. That means the two-edged sword of logic is on display here. On the one hand, anyone can make a mistake. On the other hand, it's appropriate for me to use my logic to say that his logic was wrong. It's not a self-contradiction. Well, if his is wrong, yours could be wrong also, so how can you rely on anything? Because that's what the Torah decrees. Ein l'dayin ela ma she'einav ro'os. Every judge has to make a decision on the basis of what he sees. At least when you talk about the Sanhedrin for the whole of the Jewish people, they're the ones who make the decisions, and he goes on what he sees. Together with the knowledge that he could be wrong, there's also the responsibility to use what he understands and make the decision on that basis. And that means that logic isn't free play. It's not arbitrary and not just completely hopeless. So it's a subtle matter, how the place that logic plays and when you can and cannot trust it, the extent to which you can trust it. It is a subtle matter. Someday, maybe we'll talk about Abraham and the sacrifice of Isaac. God put Abraham in a position where he was facing an absolute contradiction. There was no way to understand it. He told him that Isaac would be his continuation, and he told him to sacrifice him. He had to live with that inability to penetrate the mystery. So much so that some commentators say he would have been perfectly justified not to sacrifice him, because he had two instructions, and he can't fulfill both of them. That's why, says the Ran, God says to him, please take your son. There's a deep logical point here. He says, please, because I can't command you. Because even if I tell you, I also told you that he's going to be your continuation. So my command to sacrifice him has to be taken together with my statement that he's going to be your continuation, and you're faced with the contradiction. You're not left with a command. So I can't command you. Logically, it's impossible for you to command you. That's why I say, please, I want you to sort of volunteer for it. And he does, because it's a way of greater self-transcendence. That's another story. So here is a case where God put him to the test without logical understanding. How will you deal with it? And that's very, very important. And, all these things are aspects of how the Torah takes account of logic. The bottom line that I'm interested that you should get is that logic is very important. Logic is very important, it's generally trustworthy, and the Torah relies upon it. So it's not mystical never land where you turn off your brain. That's not our tradition. Okay.